Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of the Nexius In-Depth video podcast. You already should know my name, so I'll just skip that blah blah. And today I'll explain the command line parameters that allow you to specify where Nexius is supposed to look for your config files when loading them. The level of difficulty this time is intermediate. First, allow me to explain what you can achieve using such parameters. As I told you in the outlook of the previous session, these command line parameters allow you to have multi-user or multi-purpose environments. But what do I mean with this? Let's start with the multi-user environment. A few people might have the problem that they have to share their computer with other users, for example, family members, of which some are probably also playing Nexius. However, each player wants to have his own config file, of course. On Linux, this isn't a problem because the config files are stored in the hidden folder .nexius in your user directory anyway. On Windows, however, configs are stored on the data folder of the Nexius directory by default. And I'm sure that the solution most of you used was to create several copies of Nexius at different locations on your hard drive. But the disadvantage of this is that it takes a lot of unnecessary space, as you copied everything, also the executable files and the huge archive file from the data folder that weighs more than 600 megabytes by now. I'd like to present a better solution to you. On Windows, you can tell Nexius to use the My Documents folder to store and load your config file from. As you know, this My Documents folder is specific for each user account of Microsoft Windows, which means that its content will be a different one for each user that logged in after you started the PC. If I open my own My Documents folder, I can see that Nexius created a folder My Games in it, which contains the folder Nexius, which contains the data folder in which I find the familiar files, such as my config files, demos, screenshots, and the download cache. To get this, all I need to do is to supply the command line parameter myGames when starting Nexius. The best way to do this is to create a shortcut to your Nexius binary. You can see my shortcut here on my desktop, right-click and open its properties, go to the second tab, and after Nexius.exe, place a -mygames and click OK. That's it. Once you start your game with this shortcut, it will automatically create the My Games folder and all subfolders and config files I showed you before, and keeps using the config file from there. Now you are familiar with the options to create a multi-user environment in Windows, but I also promised you the possibility of a multi-purpose environment. What I mean is that one user might want to have different versions of Nexius. For example, he might have two different kind of configs for playing different game modes, or have one config for playing and one for watching demos and one for recording them. So in the end, you have different configs for different purposes. In this case, using the myGames parameter is not of any help, and creating different copies of your whole Nexius directory sounds like a huge waste of disk space to me as well. The solution for your problem is to use another command line parameter called userdir, standing for user directory, after which you specify the path of the directory where you want your config files to be. This path can either be a relative path, for example, if you just specify sample, it will create a directory called sample in your Nexius directory where you extracted it, or it can be an absolute path. If this absolute path contains spaces, however, make sure to quote it. On Windows, doing this just works like shown for the myGames parameter, so for the userdir parameter, I'll show this in Ubuntu Linux. I opened the directory where I extracted my Nexius copy and create a new empty text file, which I name userdir.sh. Then I'll have to make sure that this file is executable. And then I double-click it and select display so that I can edit the content in a text editor. And then I write ./Nexius minus Linux minus glx.sh, and then separated by a space minus userdir sample. Of course, you can alternatively use the Nexius Linux SDL.sh, and instead of using sample, you could use any other relative or also absolute path. Then I save the file and close the editor, double-click the file again and click on Run in Terminal. Nexius starts, and once I close it again, I can see the new directory sample, which contains the data folder which contains my config file. Before I come to the end, here are a few more hints. For Mac users who also have the problem to find the .nexius folder in your user directory, you can use the Apple-Shift-G key combo in Finder, which opens a dialog in which you can specify the path, for example, ~.nexius/data. Apart from that, in case either userdir or mygames was used, but Nexius cannot find any config file there yet, it will create one. For this, it will have a look whether it can create a copy of an existing config file from the Nexius data folder. And keep in mind that this is also the case for Linux or Mac, so it won't look in the userdir/.nexius data folder, but really in the Nexius data folder where you unpacked Nexius to. Keep in mind that this works similarly, but not entirely the same, for the auto-execute config. For example, if you decided to now use the mygames option and in the data directory of the mydocuments folder there is no auto-execute config yet, Nexius will not create a copy from your auto-execute file from Nexius data, as opposed to the config file where it did that. But in Nexius data, if there was an auto-execute config file, it would still use it, but, well, it wouldn't copy it. This behavior is something you might not want, and in this case, make sure to create or copy your new auto-execute config at the new location yourself. Alright, I hope I could show you a few tricks how to save a lot of space on your hard disk by using the mentioned command line parameters. In the next episode it will finally become really attractive, as we'll modify the size and position of a few elements in the heads-up display. This was Green Marine for the Alien Trap development team. Have a good time and see you next week.